So a lot of people want to say that God is evil, that he's genocidal, that he wiped out the entire, race of the Canaanites, and that he's evil for doing so, and that he did it for no reason, and all of these things, right? But a lot of people want to talk about these things, and then they forget. They want to forget about who were the Canaanites. What did they do? What was their practices? I think this video, I want to react to it. It's really, really good, and it really talks about it and breaks it down about the sin of the Amorites. I don't know if you guys remember reading this in the Bible, but in Genesis, there's a part where God is talking to Abraham in the dream, and he tells Abraham, your people are going to be enslaved for 400 years, but after that, I'm going to bring them into a land. I'm going to make a nation of your people. And he tells them that the reason why they're going to be enslaved for 400 years is because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full, right? So you might be wondering, like, what was the iniquity of the Amorites that God was giving them time to turn from their wickedness and go back to God, right? Before he went ahead and destroyed them, he gave them 400 years to turn back to him. That's like 4 generations or a little bit more than that, right? 4 or 5 generations, give or take. That God gave these Amorites time, this was a Canaanite tribe, to turn back. So we're going to react to this video today, and we're going to see why God destroyed these people. And I want you to ask yourself, if these things were happening where you live, if these things were happening in America today, if that's where you are, or if you're somewhere else, wherever you are, I want to know how outraged you would be if God did nothing about it. You know what I'm saying? So for those who want to say God is evil and God is genocidal because he wipes these people out, I want you to also ask yourself, is it wrong? Is it also not wrong to, not do anything about these horrible injustices that they were doing? So without further ado, let's watch the video and talk about it.
The British archaeologist Stuart McAllister began excavating at Gezer. On the Acropolis of the site, McAllister noticed that there was a row of stones whose tops were protruding through the ground. And so he began excavating the area and unearthed 12 standing stones in a row. And
have you ever heard about when they say don't worship on the high places, like don't create the high places and do the idol worship things? This is what the Bible's talking about when they're talking about the high places.
next to them was another huge stone with a flat top and a basin carved into it. And as he was excavating this area, he realized that he was digging a Canaanite high place where the ancient inhabitants of the city had worshipped their gods. Now, what McAllister found next around these standing stones is deeply disturbing. However, it shouldn't be surprising because it was evidence for a Canaanite worship practice that is described in the Bible.
Yeah, this is pretty gruesome. So just, warning anybody who's a little bit has a hard time with that, but this is pretty gruesome. If you've already read the Bible, you know this, you know what these people did. But yeah, this is pretty darn disturbing what the Canaanites did here.
I just want you to look at how big these stones are. So in his excavation report, McAllister found a pit which he described as being filled with a great number of bones of human beings in a confused heap. And nearby was the skeleton of a young girl who had evidently been sawn asunder. She had been cut in half. And found along with this the skulls of 2 other girls who had been decapitated. And this could be determined because of the cut marks through the vertebrae. And then McAllister says that all around the feet of the columns, that is the standing stones, McAllister discovered the skeletons of young infants. They were deposited in large jars, and the skeletons showed marks of fire. He started finding all over the place here, around the base of these pillars jars with burned human babies inside of them.
Wow. Yeah, so did you understand what he just said? He says that these Canaanite people were burning. I mean, we know this. I've read this in the Bible where it says do as the don't do as the people do that live in the lands. Don't sacrifice your children to Molech. Like, they used to burn the babies on the altar to their demon god Molech. And this is the proof and archaeological finding that this is exactly what they did. This is disturbing and disgraceful and just very, very upsetting to think that this is what was being done in the land of Canaan.
Okay, and this is from his excavation report. You can see the skeletal remains of a burned baby inside of the jar, buried ritually. Not just buried, but buried ritually. Now, how are they buried ritually? They're buried in a place of sacrifice, in a sacred place of worship. So
they were doing human sacrifice. And not just human sacrifice, babies. And not just like kill the baby and that's it. Like burn the baby alive. Oh my gosh. Like this is what they did. Like, we're gonna kill the baby in the most painful way possible, and we're gonna sacrifice this innocent baby that doesn't even know what's going on. Who does this? Like, who are the people that were giving up their babies to sacrifice them to Molech, to their god? I don't know. This is crazy.
Excavation report, McAllister made up.
Like, who does this? Like, no, really, like, who does that? Who carries a baby for 9 months and is like, yeah, I'm going to burn my baby on the altar to a demon god? Like, what kind of person does this? This is crazy.
Plan of the high place from the perspective of looking straight down on it. And then on this top plan, he marked with the letter J everywhere where he had found these infant jar burials. Look at all the J's, J, 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 J. See all the J's? Jar burials with not just baby bones in them, burned baby bones in them. Okay, this is about a 7-year-old girl that was cut in half. You can tell, by the way, when they're cut in half because you have a cut mark right through the vertebrae, right through the bones. Below this area, McAllister discovered a cave. And when his team cleared it, a flat stone was found at the center of the cave. Still lying upon it were the remains of the skeleton of a human infant. I know this is sobering. I know you're not having a good time, but you either want to know what's actually found in the ground or you don't. And it's important.
It's true what he's saying. I mean, it's very upsetting to see this. It's very upsetting to hear. It really is. I watched it this morning and I was like, this is awful. This is terrible. But let's think about this in the context of, why God told the Israelites to, conquer these people. He clearly wanted to stop this practice because as soon as he brought them into the land, he expected them to not do these things. Deuteronomy literally tells the Israelites specifically, it says, do not worship me like the he says, do not worship me like the Canaanites worship their gods. Do not even find out how they do it or what they're doing, so you'll not be tempted. He tells them specifically in Deuteronomy, I believe it's Deuteronomy 18, where he says, do not sacrifice your children in the fire. This is exactly what he was talking about. He says, do not cast your children into the fire. There's some versions that say don't make them pass through the fire. This was literally what they're talking about. Exactly this practice that's recorded in Deuteronomy that God tells them not to do. He wanted this stopped. He had them conquer the Canaanites to stop this. And I'm sorry, but if this is what they were doing, I think it's pretty much, you can say that it's justice, that God told them to wipe them out. I mean, wouldn't you feel like that if this is what you found out people were doing where you live? I'm just saying. Would you want to let it go? Would you be like, no, no, it's okay. It's okay. Let's just, no, you wouldn't. I mean, gosh, how do we feel about when we hear about school shootings? We feel outraged and we feel angry and we feel upset. But this is like totally different. This is like people voluntarily taking their babies and sacrificing them to Molech. You know what I mean? I mean, even like with abortion nowadays, you've got a lot of people that really don't care about it because they don't even see it that it's a real thing. They're like, oh, it's not even a real baby. But like, imagine this is like a real baby and it's crying and you can hear it and you can see it and you gave birth to it and like how, like, that's not even, you can't even deny that. I mean, not that you can deny it now with a baby that's not born, because obviously you shouldn't, but there are people who do. We won't get into that. That's a big that's a big discussion. It's for another video, but yeah, but I mean, gosh, can you imagine people doing this and voluntarily doing it? It's not like they just took the babies. These people gave their children. It says they sacrificed their children to Molech.
Important to know what's actually found in the ground.
Lord.
So essentially, for McAllister, it was like excavating a crime scene. What happened here? What was going on? And so he had the evidence, but he still needed to interpret it. And what McAllister used to interpret what he'd found in the ground was the Bible. Numbers 13:29 says that the Amorites live in the hill
Boom, here we go. We're going to talk about these scriptures.
country of Canaan. Since Gezer was located in the hill country of Canaan, he interpreted it to be an Amorite city. So who were the Amorites? They were Canaanites. Why? Because they descended from the man Canaan. And the Amorites were the most powerful of the Canaanite tribes. McAllister used Exodus 23 that mentions the Amorites' sacred stones to identify the row of sacred stones he had unearthed at Gezer. The other large stone with the flat top he identified as an altar, and the purpose of its carved-out basin was for catching the blood of sacrifices. Based on these verses, McAllister knew the site he was excavating was a Canaanite high place where Amorites had worshipped their gods. The many idols found in the area provided evidence that this was a cultic site. Among the many idols that were found was a bronze serpent representing Molech, the king of the Amorite gods.
See, there you go. There it is. Oh, this is so hard to watch. I'm so sorry. It's really hard. But it's true. We have to know the truth, right? We have to know exactly what's really happening and what happened back then, right? Because we have to see, we have to take God in the light of truth and what it really is, not just what atheists are running around saying or what people are doing, taking the Bible out of context. Like, oh, look, God's so bad and he's so horrible because he just wipes out these innocent people. This doesn't seem very innocent to me. This is turning my stomach listening to what these people did.
Remember reading about Molech in the Bible? This is how he is represented, a snake. Who do you think the snake is that's getting the Canaanites to sacrifice their own children?
In Deuteronomy 12:31, the Lord says to the Israelites, "You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods."
Boom, right there. There it is. Yes, because look at that in Deuteronomy 13. They're going to talk about it more in Deuteronomy 18 if you keep going. Yeah, this is what it says. It says you should not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things that the Lord hates. It says the Lord hates this. It says he hates that they're sacrificing and burning their babies on the altar to Molech. It says that he hates this. Okay, if he's if God was evil and he was bad, why would he hate this? God said, I'm going to wipe them out. I'm going to remove them from this land because of these detestable things that they're doing. Okay, This is justice. This is not genocide. Come on, people. I hope you see this. This is so clear. Just use your common sense. Like, get outside of your, if you're still like, oh no, I don't think so. Like, get outside of whatever preconceived notion you have. This is so clearly obvious. It really is.
Using this verse and others like it, McAllister labeled the picture of the remains of a burned human baby as a sacrificed infant buried in a jar. The severed human remains he also interpreted as evidence for child sacrifice. What was the crime? Child sacrifice. What was the evidence? The remains of sacrificed children.
5,000 years of Chinese music and dance in one night. A spectacle.
Think about it. What other explanation is there for burned babies in a jar around standing stones?
So it's important
Exactly.
to point out that McAllister wasn't interpreting these finds in some bizarre way. The other archaeologists that were digging in Canaanite cities were finding similar remains, and they were interpreting them in the same way. Just to give one brief example, Kathleen Kenyon was excavating in the 1950s in the Amorite city of Jericho. And in her book, Digging Up Jericho, she wrote, "There is an unpleasant suggestion of infant sacrifice. Besides one complete infant burial, a collection of infant skulls with the neck vertebrae attached, showing that the heads were cut off and not merely collected from burials."
Oh God, you see, this is horrible. This is the things they were doing. Before you go ahead and say that God is the genocidal maniac or something crazy like that, do some historical research on who these people were that God came in and wiped out or just drove out or whatever. And like let's look at what these people were doing. You've gotta take this into consideration before you just make a blanket statement like, oh, God is evil because he did this or that. Like, come on. It's the same way I was talking to somebody in the comment section about Pharaoh and hardening his heart. Pharaoh was evil too. Like, Pharaoh was an idol worshiper, and he did all these horrible things. He was already hard of heart before God says, I'm gonna harden his heart. And he did all kinds of things and gave Pharaoh all kinds of chances to turn to him. God just didn't just rush in and be like, oh God, here we go, Pharaoh, harden your heart and I'm gonna do whatever I want. Like, come on, you've got to read the whole thing. Like, stop just taking a verse you saw on YouTube, or like one verse you saw on TikTok, or one verse that some atheist online said, oh, look at this verse, look at that verse. No, go back and study the whole thing. You have to read the entire thing, and you have to look at it with logic and reason, and think about what was going on and look at the history and who were these people groups. Were they really innocent people groups? Were they really? It doesn't sound like it to me. Like I said, if this was happening in your town today, I think you'd be calling for justice. I mean, let's think about the BLM riots, right? People, how many years later, are still angry about slavery in the United States, correct? People are still outraged about that. What if this was happening? How much more outraged would we be? I mean, they're calling to get rid of races and stuff like that, and white people need to bow down to black people, and we need to do all these things. I mean, just over slavery, right? Imagine this. This is like, it's like slavery's horrific enough, but this is like even more, 10 times more horrific. This is just terrible. So imagine what people would be doing if this was happening. What kind of justice would be being called? Would we all just let it go? Would we just let it be? Oh, but now God is evil because he didn't let that go, because he doesn't just let that be, right? Even though he lets it be for a while and he gives people time to turn back, he still does, right? But let's just watch the rest of the video. I'm just saying.
And so McAllister took the evidence of child sacrifice he had found and wrote it up in a chapter that he titled The Iniquity of the Amorites. It's interesting in these early days how McAllister goes a step further, and he not only uses the Bible to interpret the evidence that he finds in the ground, but he also uses it theologically to identify this is evidence for iniquity. This is evidence for sin.
Yes, we talked about that at the very beginning of the movie when he says to Abraham, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. This is what he was talking about. This is exactly what he was talking about.
Why did McAllister call this child sacrifice sin? Because the Bible called it sin. Why is it sin? Because the Lord hates this practice and it's against his law. When God gave his law to his people Israel, it was against the law to sacrifice their children. In Leviticus 18:21, God commands Israel, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech." Leviticus 20 verse 2 states, "Any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death."
Boom, there it is. Yeah, see, I was talking about this. This is exactly what he's talking about. He doesn't want this to keep happening, and he doesn't want the Israelites to go and do the same thing.
Child sacrifice is sin because it is against God's law, and the penalty for committing this sin was death. So God in the Bible,
And people are saying like, "Oh, God has all these rules, and he's terrible, and he's so bad." But I mean that I don't think those rules are really bad. I think it's pretty much a lot of common sense things. I'm not talking about like the ceremonial stuff. That's a whole nother thing. But these basic moral laws, he doesn't want these things to happen to people.
the Bible is accusing the Amorites of committing this great evil of child sacrifice. And the archeological evidence bears out the reality that indeed the Canaanites did practice this evil and were guilty. Now, some might argue, well, the Canaanites weren't treated fairly because they didn't have God's law. God didn't give them his law. However,
Let me say something about that. Let me say something about that. Do we really, if you want to say like, oh, it's not fair because they didn't have God's law. Okay. If you're not a Christian, tell me that you don't know deep down inside that it's wrong to burn babies on an altar to a demon god. Tell me you don't feel like that's wrong deep down inside somehow. Tell me you don't know that. God has put his law on our hearts. We're all born with a conscience of knowing what's right and wrong. This is why, it's interesting that a lot of people will say that, Christians need to leave, LGBT alone. Christians need to leave these people alone and those people alone. And they need to leave people alone and let them live their lives how they want. Well, the thing is if it's not really wrong and y'all don't really believe that these things are wrong, and you don't have any conscience about it, then why do you care what anybody says? I'm just saying, because if you really don't think your lifestyle or the things you're doing are wrong and your conscience is not telling you anything that's wrong about it, why do you care what we say? Why do you even care what God says? Because that's not the case. Because deep down inside, we all know right and wrong. We all have a conscience, and we all have a deep feeling of, you know what, this doesn't feel right. What I'm doing, it feels like something is off. It feels wrong. It doesn't feel right, and I have to quench my my conscience. In order to do these things, I have to really, really like get myself to a place that I'm okay with doing these bad things in order to do them and not feel anything. But I think in reality, we really do still feel it. Even if we've pushed it way down, we do know it's wrong. So there's no excuse for these people burning babies. There's just no excuse for it.
God has created all people to know in their hearts whether something like a practice of sacrificing children is good or evil.
Boom, he just said it. See, I didn't even know he was going to say that. It's easy. We know this. We don't need somebody to tell us that this is right or wrong. God created us to know that this is wrong. We know this.
And it's clearly, we all know in our hearts, our conscience bearing witness that it is an evil practice. So everyone is without excuse.
Boom. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not going to watch the whole video. You can watch it. I'll put the link in the description, but I thought this was really interesting and, just kind of wanted to come against those again in the comments that like to say, oh, your God is evil and he's like this. And because of you, this and that and da, 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 da. It's, there's a reason for it. There's always a reason behind what God does, because I did make a video about, is God really evil? What about these evil things that they say, God does, and why he sends an evil spirit and whatever. You can go back and take a look at that. But yeah, a lot of people were trying to say, that, God doesn't have any reasons for this. But if you're questioning these kinds of things, yeah, go look at the archaeology, look at the history of these people that God came against or drove out or destroyed. There's always a reason behind why he's doing it. It's like the difference between somebody who murders in cold blood, with no real good reason, versus somebody who murders, no, I'm not even going to say it's a murder. I'm going to say kills somebody who, breaks into their house and they kill their whole family, right? But you were trying to protect your family, so you kill the guy who came and broke in your house. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. And I'm going to put that as the same thing that's happening here with God and in other places that God wipes people out. And then at the end of the day, he's our creator. So how are you going to go and think that you, that you know more than him? I really love this Bizzle song where he says, I created the same mind that you question me from, right? So you're over here questioning God, but he's the one who even created your mind to allow you to question. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying it's wrong to question, because we should question. We should find answers, question to find answers, right? We should definitely do that. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't question. We definitely should. I am a question person. I want to know why. I am that person, right? But as far as saying like, no, God, you were wrong for doing XYZ, I haven't found any instance where he has been where he was, because when you really sit down and look at it, you're like, no, you know what? God had a reason for that. He had a good reason for that. And in this case with the Canaanites, he had more than a reason to drive them out, wipe them out, etc. But he didn't wipe. If you really go and look at it, it's like not every single person down to the last animal and child and everything. That's not what happened, because there were still Canaanites after this. So if the whole entire people were killed and wiped out, that'd mean that there wouldn't be any Canaanite survivors. It would mean that the Amorites and the Canaanites were just completely gone, wiped off the face of the earth. And we know later on in the Bible that that's not the case, and that didn't happen either. So clearly he did spare some. But for the most part, he drove them out the land and they warred, and that's what it was. So get your facts straight next time before you blame God.